Hi everyone, I just wanted to talk a little bit about which types of graph you should use in different situations. So as we know, graphs are used to display a message about the shape of the data, and they help us look at it and be able to interpret it. But different graphs work best for different types of data, so I wanted to talk about those. So for quantitative data, so that's when we're talking about data with numbers, continuous or discrete, histograms and stem and leaf plots are both really good for that type of data. With stem and leaf plots, all values are included, as we talked about before, and histograms, each group, well, they can be done two ways. So if we have a look at the two histograms that are underneath there, that are displayed, we've got a histogram that has each column which is for one particular value. So number 0, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. So that would be the type that you might use for discrete data. Or the one on the right is a histogram that uses classes or intervals, group intervals. And you can see that each bar is a group of values. So, and you can tell the difference because the histogram on the left has the scale markings, the axis markings in the center of the bars, whereas the histogram on the right has the scale markings on the actual edges of the bars. So, for example, the first bar is 250 up to 300. 300 is not included. That starts in the next bar. And you can see each one of those bars on the histogram on the right is worth a group of values. And of course, the frequency on the y-axis for the same, for both of them is the same. Don't forget, you could also use back-to-back histograms or back-to-back stem and leaf plots, and they're particularly good when you want to show two related sets of data together on the same graph, which can be helpful in interpreting what type of data you're looking at and how they relate. So that's one way, or a couple of ways you can display quantitative data in different types of graphs. On that note, though, if we just look at what type of distribution we might get, oops, I went too far, is I wanted to look at the type of distribution you might get after you plot a stem and leaf plot or a histogram. So just to remind you what the names of those are, so for a histogram, we'll talk about histograms for all of these things. So for a histogram that has data fairly evenly spread around the mean, so the mean is the highest value in the center and the rest are fairly evenly spread, and they don't have to be exact, but it must look something like the top one. That's called symmetrical distribution, or you might say it's approximately or almost symmetrical depending on what you've got. Then of course there's two types of skewed distribution or skewed graph. So the two graphs underneath that are both skewed, but one is what's called a negative skew and one is what's called a positive skew. And over on the right hand side is some more explanations that might help you recognize that. So the negative skew is called that when the long tail is on the negative side of the peak, the left hand side, heading in this direction to the left. So when the long part of the graph, or as the values get lower and lower, heading towards the negative, it's called a negative skewed graph. The positive skewed graph is just the opposite. So in this case, the long tail heads towards the positive direction. So that is why it's called a positive skewed graph, just in the same way as a negative is called a negative. There's also a distribution called a bimodal, and that's when you've got like two distinct highest values there. So you can see here we've got a high one here and we've got a high one here, bimodal. So there's two modes, two most occurring values. You could have more than two modes. You can have lots of modes realistically, and that just means we would call that multimodal instead of bimodal. But if it's just a single one, that's when we use symmetrical skewed instead. Okay. So, just continuing on, box and whisker plots are also good, and they'll be covered a little bit later on how to draw those. You could also show quantitative data well that way, but let's have a quick talk about categorical data and good ways to describe or show distributions of categorical data are some of these graphs. Bar graphs, which is like histograms, but there's a gap between each one, and they can be drawn horizontally or vertically, as it is in this case. Line graphs, which is the one down the bottom, which is just a line joining up all the data, so you plot dot points and then join them up with lines. Or a pie chart, which is what it sounds like. It's a circle, and it's a pie drawn up, split up into different sections, and each section's size depends on how big the values are for that category. So these are always great ways to display categorical data. Categories don't overlap usually, so that's why they work for this. So hopefully that helps you get going on what type of graph you should be doing. Okay, thanks.